Hi there, my name is David Kenney. Welcome to our program, Light from Above. We're interviewing my parents. Glad to have them here, that they would be here. My dad is nearly completing a gospel meeting in Wadsworth, Ohio. We'll show you the flyer here. He's delivering some lessons on the Christian man. He's been doing that all week. He's also come into the studio to record here, so you'll be able to see these lessons as well. And we're very grateful that he's willing to do that. Brought my parents in, so I thought we'd sit down and talk with them a few minutes. Because it really relates to the meeting. Last time we talked about their family background leading up to when Dad would go to the Nashville School of Preaching. And just a little bit about that, here's a photograph you can look at, sort of a collage. Dad graduated from the Nashville School of Preaching. He was part of the graduating class May 22nd, 1970s, the date on the certificate there. It was at Waverly Belmont Church Building. And I have a picture there of Charles Brewer and also your graduating class. Dad studied under, who were some of the teachers that you studied under, and maybe make a comment about, I know one of them was you liked particularly well. I thought maybe just tell them some of the preachers that you studied under when you were in the school.
Okay, thank you. I was privileged to sit at the feet of B.C. Goodpasture, for example. Brother Goodpasture was an elder of the Hillsboro Church of Christ. He was the preacher at the Hillsboro Church of Christ and the editor of one of our longest running papers, the Gospel Advocate. And it was a treat to be in his class. He was a very dignified man and a very good Bible student. I studied under Eugene Peden, who was a missionary to Nigeria, and preached full-time in Fayetteville, Tennessee, where another mutual friend of ours preaches now, different congregation. I sat under H. Clyde Hale. Brother Charles Brewer was the president of the school, and he taught several classes. He was an amazing man. He could speak 5 languages. And not only so, when a teacher could not fulfill their assigned duties for an evening, he never had substitutes come in. He just went in and took their class. And he didn't go in and teach something else. He went in and taught what they were going to teach. He was a brilliant, highly educated man, and it meant so much to me. I sat at the feet of Clifford Owens, and one of my favorites was A.T. Pate. And you and I see A.T. Pate every year at Freed Hardeman University lectureships in Henderson, Tennessee. And if I see him 6 times a day, he tells me, "I'm proud of you." And that just melts me. And I think he does the same for you. And that's just some of the men that come to mind. E. Ray Jerkins, F. Garvin Smith, and others that mean so much to me. And every one of them donated their time. They did not receive a dime for all the teaching they did, and some of them drove several miles to be there to teach. And I appreciate the sacrifice that they made so old country boys like me and others could learn to preach the gospel.
Now, the Nashville School of Preaching started in 1966 from the research I did. So it's a fairly young school when you started to attend there. And a lot of people, Nashville School of Preaching is different than some of the schools of preaching today, because a student would have to go and raise support to be able to attend to study. Or if they would go to a Christian college, they would have to borrow money and do all that, or scholarships or things like that. But the Nashville School of Preaching, for what you told me, is different in that these men donated their time. And the class format was set up to where you would have to go out and work a regular full-time job in order to support your family, and also study. It seems like classes were 2 times a night, or 2 times a week.
3.
At the night? 3? Okay. Several hours, 2 or 3 hours.
Start at 7, end at 10.
Yeah, something like, yeah. And so there's a lot of, it's a unique format. A lot of preachers went through this school. One of the I remember one of the people that you mentioned often, Basil Overton was one of your teachers, and you
Oh,
talked
yes.
about
I'm
how.
sorry, I forgot him.
No, that's all right. And you talked about, when you talk about trying to encourage other preachers and everything, and I remember you talking about, how much Basil would stay and talk to the students afterwards. Because these people, they have, these teachers, Charles Brewer was G.C. Brewer's brother, who was a scholar in the church, and you have a lot of people here that are really committed to train or to learn how to preach the gospel, and that had to be a big influence on your life to have these kinds of men be able to come in and to do that and to interact with them, and you had to work. It seems like you told me, didn't you have to work in construction, helping to build a bomb shelter at one time?
I did. I worked in a drugstore at another time.
And it seems like, was it during this time that Mom worked for 20th Century Bookstore under Jim Bill McIntyre?
Yes.
So it's, you obviously have one son, one child.
Yes.
And you're studying, and you're working and everything. So it had to be a very busy time. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, Dad, is, and this is a question I'll put to you, what traits should a young man work to develop to be an effective preacher in located work? What kind of traits should he work to develop?
Well, one of the traits that I think is most important is he must be a hard worker. He must love studying, and I know that if you haven't done much of it, people wouldn't think that studying the scriptures is hard work, but it is hard work. In fact, I was encouraging a young man to preach a few years ago. Wonderful young man, very talented young man. And he and I were sitting in a social get-together at church building, talking, and I was encouraging him to preach because I thought, based on what I knew about him, that he would make a wonderful preacher. And he said, I have thought about that, and I have considered that, but I don't like to study. And I immediately said, don't preach, because it involves hard study. It involves integrity. You have to have integrity in order to do what you're going to do, because you're going to be doing it without any supervision. I don't have to have a boss with me all the time. I work pretty much on my own, so I have to have the integrity, and I think that I do, to carry out my work without being told, do this, do that, do the other thing. You have to have honesty in that you will not claim to have done things that you didn't do, or other things as well. And then an interest in people. You've got to know, you've got to be interested in their lives, and they won't really warm to you unless you warm to them. And it's very important that you take an interest in their lives, that you bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And I'm sure that there are other things that are equally important, but those are the things that come to mind. But very high on my list would be to develop good study habits.
Yeah, that's something I can tell you from growing up with Dad. That's always something that's been very important to him, and it's if you're gonna represent God and you're gonna represent His Word and you're gonna be teachers, the Bible cautions, if you're going to teach others, you're going to be held to a stricter judgment, and that's a big responsibility that too many people just take too lightly, and it's a serious weight. It can be a very when you have to when people do things they're not supposed to be doing, and it's a preacher's responsibility to proclaim the things they're supposed to be doing. That can add a lot of stress, and you still have to represent God, and you have to, like you said, you have to have integrity, you have to have authenticity to be able to do that, to where people know that I understand that Warren Kenney's saying these things, but I understand that's what the Bible's saying. That is what the Bible is saying. And so that's so very important. Show you, here's a picture of my dad when in his younger preaching days. Don Cooper gave me this photograph. I'm glad he did it. So he looks a little different now. Doesn't have the glasses. So
yeah, among other things.
These are some of the places that he's been located. Currently he's in Martinsburg, West Virginia. One of the statements that I copied down that he made, now this July 2014 will mark 45 years of preaching, if I'm correct. And one of the statements that he made that I jotted down from a long time ago was this statement. He said, "My favorite part of preaching is the pulpit. I love teaching people the grand old truths that they might not otherwise know. I believe the Bible is an exciting, living book, and I do my best to convey that to the people I am privileged to teach." Now, still true?
Still true. My motto of preaching has always been 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 16. Take heed unto yourself and unto the doctrine, continue in them, for in doing this you will save both thyself and them that hear thee. Still true.
Now, in that slide there's, I put down the number of years that you've been in these different locations. Some of them, without, going through all the different locations, we just don't have time to do that. But, like any kind of career a person has, there are good times and there are not so good times. There's difficulties, there are adversities, there's periods of great stress. And some people, they seem to think that a preacher doesn't go through difficulties, that everything will, if you're a part of the church, there won't be any challenges. But we know that that's just not true. I mean, you've told me several times, you have two parts of the church. You have the divine side, which is perfect, but it's made up of us who are imperfect. And then you have imperfect people. Things sometimes, they become challenging. They become very difficult, very stressful. And one of the things I wanted to ask is, what words of advice would you give to young preachers if they are faced with adversity in their local work? I mean, what kind of things would you tell them? Because, they're going to run into challenges. They're going to run into adversity. I mean, you know that as well as I do. What kind of things would you want to impress upon them?
Well, I think that one thing that I would impress on them beforehand is something that was impressed upon me by the late David Myers that you knew. And that was God's people, like you just said, God's people are not perfect, and they will make mistakes. And I didn't believe that at the time, but it didn't take me long to realize that he had told me the truth. And it might have taken me a little longer to realize that I'm not perfect, that I'm hard to get along with at times. And because of the fact you have the preacher who's not perfect and the membership that's not perfect, you're going to have times of adversity. One of the most important things that I have always tried to remember is to love them. By this shall all men know you're my disciples, if you love one another. So we have to continue to love one another even in times of adversity, not make those personal vendettas or attacks against one another. Try to realize that you're both on the same team. You're both serving the same Lord, and try to work those things out in as loving and calm and peaceful a way as possible, because after all, we're dealing with the Lord's church. And if we tear up the Lord's church, that's a terrible sin. We need to be careful about that. I would also advise them not to take everything personally that people say. It took me a long time to learn that. I would internalize criticism, and maybe I would be down emotionally for 2 or 3 days because of one critic, maybe a week because of one critic. I have learned not to do that. I allow people to be critical if they want to be, but I let it roll off my back. I don't carry it with me like I used to. If you take everything personally and internalize it, a big part of your life is going to be miserable. And we don't want to go through life being miserable. And probably above everything else, since you mentioned young preacher, probably above everything else, I would advise them, don't criticize the church in front of your family, because you will lose your family if you're not careful. Your mother and I had a little saying when you were a little boy and your sisters were still at home. If we got close to saying something critical of the church or of one of the brethren, one of us would say to the other, big ears are listening. And by that we meant one of you children would hear what we say and you'd take it to heart. And we wanted you to grow up loving the church. And so we were very careful never to criticize the church in your presence. And I think probably that would be the most important piece of advice I could give any young preacher. Don't criticize the church in front of your family, in front of your children in particular. And in fact, try not to be critical of the church anyway, but especially before your family, because you'll work things out one way or another, but that'll be in their mind, in their heart, for the rest of their lives. Now, I don't know that I'm in a position to judge how well your mother and I did with that. You would be in a better position to do that, but I can say that we were very careful.
Well, I've been doing this TV show for a little while now, and I never thought I would ever do a TV show. And so there's evidence that I can remember the only time that I knew of negative things, damaging things, were things that you just couldn't shield us from. I just remember that, and those things are they're going to happen. You mentioned in industry. I used to work in industry. That one of the things that they tell people, don't ever talk bad about your previous employer. It just hurts yourself. But as a preacher, it's even more. It's not just hurting yourself. You're hurting any prospect that wants to, they recognize that people are imperfect, but they want to be a part of the perfect church. And if you fill them up with a bunch of imperfections, they'll never be able to see the perfect. So yeah, that's very good advice. Here's a picture of my dad. This is in Centralia, Illinois, with his library. It's a little larger today than it was back then. He's a big lover of books. One of our favorite things to do is to shop for books together. And the library and research is very important to him. And he's talked about a little bit more, but I'll ask him this question. This is one of the questions I want to talk about a little bit again, is how important have books been to your efforts in preaching the gospel? And what is the value of books today?
Oh, my books are my friends. And this is probably not part of your question, but I have my library arranged pretty much that if I'm studying on a particular subject, I can go to a section of my library and pull off books from the shelf that deal with that subject. I can usually do that in just a minute. And they are my friends because I can open that book and read what they have to say on the subject that I'm dealing with. Now, the thing that I find to be kind of discouraging is I'll be studying on a subject. Let's just pull one out of the air. I'll be studying on the subject of baptism, for example. And I will say to myself, I wonder if T.W. Brents had something to say on that would be better than the way I would say it. And the discouraging part is it seems like they always do say it better than what I would have said it. But books are just so valuable, and they're so expensive. I remember several years ago, we had a treasurer where I was preaching, and he was getting up insurance for the church and church building and things. And he came into my study, and he looked around my bookshelves, and there would have been about that many books that you have on the screen at that time. And he said, I suppose you have, what, $500 worth of books in here? And I said, that one set of books, 24 volumes, is $500. And he was amazed. Pulpit commentary. He was amazed and flabbergasted. We have spent literally thousands and thousands of dollars on books. And thankfully, she's never objected to that. We have bought books when it was very, very difficult to buy books because they're important. I illustrate it like this. A carpenter goes out on a job. He carries a toolbox. Those books are my toolbox, and I use them accordingly.
Mom, you have anything to say? I mean, you had to go, it's, your family, preachers, they don't make a lot of money.
No.
Money could be tight, and to be able to spend, money on books, I mean, that's got to be a big sacrifice. And, how do you feel? I mean, obviously it's easier if you're buying a book you want, but, how important do you think books were to Dad?
Books were very important, and it's part of preaching. You need the books, and so you need the books. I mean, it's just like you need food, you need the books. You just have to have them, so you arrange your money so that you get the ones you need. Sometimes it's tight, and we have to figure out how we're going to do it, but we get the books.
Yeah, so they're important. Well, here's a compilation, a collage of different preachers that I made up. There's some of these preachers you've known for many years, and people like Artie Collins and A.T. Pate and Dwight Butler and Ken Easter and Tom Holland and Don Cooper. There's Jody Apple, Winfred Claiborne, Sam Bartrug, Randy Chapman, all Bob Eddy. The middle picture is a group from Frank Hickenbotham's, late Frank Hickenbotham's funeral. A lot of preachers in there. I can't remember what the official count was of preachers that we had there in that shot there. But I want to ask you, Dad, about what about being a part of? They have the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police. It's like a brotherhood and all that. But what about being a part of the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Preachers? How important are other preachers? When you're located, man, in an area, it's not like another industry where you can go and talk to someone just down the street about something. Like maybe you will go talk to another restaurant manager, or maybe you'll go and you can go to a group and on a seminar and all that. When you network, even in industry, they talk about the importance of networking with other professionals. And I mean, how important is to have a good relationship with other preachers, maybe not just locally, but even beyond locally? I mean, how important is that to a preacher?
It's very important. Some of my very best friends are preachers. Some of the ones that you've mentioned right now are some of the best friends that I have on this earth, and I lean on them. It's very encouraging when you're dealing with some kind of, we'll use that word again, adversity, or maybe wrestling with a Bible question, to pick up the telephone and dial that number and hear Bob Eddy or Don Cooper or those others that you mentioned on the other end of the line, and after your initial conversation, which is usually a bunch of silliness among preachers, tell them the reason I've called is I want to ask you this, and draw upon their wisdom. It is tremendously important.
Well, that's all we have time for in this episode, so stay tuned and we'll conclude our interview with this next program. Thanks for watching our program today. Before we close our program today, we'd like to take a moment and review this roadmap to heaven with you since the matter is so serious. There are many incorrect set of directions out there, and sadly so many people are following them. For example, some people have been given wrong turns. They believe things such as faith only, works only, or grace only. Or some attempt to change the order of the turns, being baptized before they even believe. Some people fail to realize what point they are on the map. Don't even open their Bibles yet, and they think they're saved already. As a person travels in a car or takes a hike, it has to follow the proper directions, so we must follow the proper directions to heaven. Let's take a look at the directions on our roadmap to heaven here. You have to look at these passages in your Bible for yourself. We'll just list the steps, the turns on the way. First is to believe or to have faith. And then number 2, to repent, to turn away from sin. Number 3 is to confess that Jesus is the Son of God. Number 4 is immersion, or to be baptized, which is a burial in water to have your sins washed away. And then you're added to the church by the Lord, not by a group of people, or not by giving some kind of testimonial experience or things like that. And then once you're added, you need to serve and worship the Lord faithfully all the days of your life. And the key word's faithfully. You don't waver. And that's very important. We need to keep in mind, too, that in Noah's day there was a big flood, and only people in the ark were saved from the flood. The same is true today. There is no salvation outside the Lord's church. Where are you on the roadmap to heaven? Thanks for watching our program. Please let us know if we can assist you with further information for your journey.